When did international cricket start? The way some people talk about the game, you'd think the answer was sometime between 1877, when the first test was played between Australia and England, and 1983, when Kapil Dev lifted the World Cup for India. But the answer is actually 1844. And it wasn't between Australia and England. In fact, neither of those teams played. It was between the United States and Canada. And it has been argued that this was actually the first international in any sport. To some this will be news, but this alone is a fairly well-known tidbit among strong fans of cricket. But most people don't know more than just that it happened. They know nothing about the actual game, which is weird because the match itself was an incredibly bizarre and brilliant story. The match has its origins in 1840, when the St George's Club in New York received a challenge to play a match against the Toronto Cricket Club from a man called George Philpotts. Believing themselves to be the best cricket club in the land, the St George Club accepted the challenge and headed north for a week of travel to Toronto. When they arrived at the Toronto Cricket Club, the first farce of this ordeal reared its head, as none of the Toronto players had any idea what they were doing there, and none had any knowledge of any supposed challenge. Not least George Philpotts, the club wicketkeeper, whose name had been appropriated by some scoundrel to organise the game. In fact, Toronto had already had a game scheduled for that weekend, but presumably in an attempt to save face for everyone involved, the two clubs agreed to play anyways. Now, this isn't the international match we're referring to, but they had a jolly old Victorian time and got extremely drunk by all accounts, and agreed to make it an annual match. The 1841 game was well-spirited, but Toronto won. So in the next game, New York did what all dodgy clubs do when they're up against it, and they brought in some ringers from neighbouring clubs. This caused great umbrage because, let's be frank, if you're playing a contest between two clubs, you can't just bring in whoever you want. This caused a furor, and in the end, St George said something to the effect of, well, next time we play, you can pick anyone from clubs your side of the border, and we can do the same. And the next fixture, now gathering media attention and public interest, was to be played for a stake of $1,000. These weren't just club teams now. It was effectively the United States versus Canada. Or, if we're perhaps being a bit more realistic, the American side was mostly St George with a couple of Union Cricket Club players and also maybe some other New York clubs, versus a Toronto team with some people from the local university club and some from a random place I've never heard of called Guelph. Some sources will claim that the USA team had Philadelphian or Bostonian players, but I have not really found any convincing evidence for that, to be honest. And the book 60 Years of Canadian Cricket claimed that Philadelphian players did not play for the US team until the fixture after this one.
Weirdly enough, though, the same source actually claims that some players who we'll go over in a minute for the US team are from Philadelphia, so I don't know, believe whatever you want. You can see at the bottom it says there that the players with an asterisk next to the name in that scorecard were from Philadelphia, apparently, so I don't know.
But don't let that fool you. These were elite international athletes. The Canadians were led by their inspirational captain, we don't actually know who their captain was. We know who the American captain was, but for some reason we don't know the Canadian one. Andy Bull from The Guardian seems to suggest that it was David Winkworth, but I've found absolutely no corresponding evidence for that whatsoever. David Winkworth, though, would top score for Canada in both their innings and was a star bowler. Winkworth would later become a turncoat and play for the US against Canada in an act of Billy Hughes-esque rodentry. He opened the batting with John Wilson, or maybe it was James Wilson. We actually don't know for sure, but we'll assume it's John. We do know that he had taken apart the New York team with a staggering 14 runs in their 1843 clash, and was also one of the all-time great long stops. Apparently because he would just let the ball smash his shin. In this match, he made a pair. The father of Canadian cricket, George Barber, played, a man who had no thumb on his right hand for reasons that I cannot work out. He also seems to have been most famous for financial impropriety whilst working at the local university. Beverly Robinson, the best fighter in Toronto in 1840s terms at least. A prodigy who'd been representing the Toronto Cricket Club since at least the age of 13. There are Cricket Archive scorecards from that age. He was from one of the most important families in Toronto, the son of a famous politician, and Robinson would in time become the mayor of Toronto. Apparently a good fielder, he made 1 and 4 and didn't seem to bowl. Harry Maddock, a man who was barely 5 foot tall, and basically the only known fact about him is that he apparently always played in a beaver hat. And a guy called Freeling. We know nothing about him, not even his first name, except that he was apparently an absolutely cracked fielder. But they had competition. The Americans actually bothered to name their captain, Robert Tinson, a carpet salesman. He was, by all accounts, and we have very few, so all accounts, a very fine wicketkeeper. Sam Wright, the St George Club groundsman, played and took 9 wickets on the pitch that he himself prepared, which seems to have not raised any eyebrows or alarms at all, so maybe I'll be the first to criticise him for that. 2 of his sons became international cricketers and then Hall of Fame baseballers too. They also had Robert Beige, who didn't seem to bowl, or at least he didn't take any wickets, and he batted 11. So I'm sure he was a useful inclusion on the trip. George Wheatcroft, the US's star batsman, who was the only player in the entire match with any first-class experience, having played for Sheffield before leaving the UK. He will come to play an interesting role in the story. And Samuel Dudson, an all-rounder who would go on to be involved in an enormous incident in a later match between the two sides when he was bowling at a Canadian batsman named Helliwell. Helliwell skied a ball, and instead of just, accepting his lot in life as one would do and hoping that Dudson would drop it, he instead charged at Dudson with either his shoulder or his bat, knocking him to the ground and hurting him badly. But Dudson took the catch anyways. Helliwell defended himself by claiming that he thought that batsmen were allowed to attack fielders, which I think was once true, but genuinely his response was that he thought he was allowed to do it. As Helliwell was walking off the ground, Dudson then, in a state of rage, charged back at the batsman as if to get revenge, and though he was stopped by his teammates, he still had the ball, so he just chucked it at Helliwell. But it was apparently a very weak throw, and it barely hit the fleshy part of his thigh. And amidst all of this, for some reason that I can't work out, the Canadians felt that they had been wronged and refused to play the rest of the game. I will remind you that their batsman just attacked the opposition because he thought he was going to be caught. And perhaps the biggest disgrace in all this, Cricinfo's bio on Dudson gets the incident completely wrong and asserts that he was actually the batsman. So, I don't know, maybe they should get onto that. Anyways, I must admit we have less funny information about the USA team than the Canadian team because, from what I can tell, most of the background info we have on these players and the game comes from one 1895 reference on Canadian cricket, and it's an incredible read. You can get it through the Internet Archive. On to the actual game. Over 5,000 fans flocked to attend, but whether they were just there for the game or more for the gambling is up for debate, given they wagered an absolutely absurd, by 1840 standards, $100,000 on the match. The first day generally saw good cricket once the game actually got started, because for no reason whatsoever they seemed to start 100 minutes late. The Canadians were sent in and made 82. Accounts note that the opening spell was tricky, that fielding started poorly but improved, and that the keeping was excellent, and that people went absolutely crazy when the number 10 batsman hit the first boundary of the match. All in all, the first innings lasted a bit over 2 hours. The Americans then had their go and made a rollicking start, hitting 8 runs from the first 12 balls, which mightn't sound like a lot, but rest assured this is the 1840s equivalent of like Tim David hitting 6 boundaries in an over or something. The USA ended the day at 61 for 9. Though, to be charitable to the Canadian bowling and fielding, They were apparently indescribably excellent, and Winkworth in particular astonished all. You will note that I'm not harping on individual scores here because the scorecard is a complete mess and doesn't add up at all, and there are conflicting individual scores across different sources. But I'm happy enough to say the total team scores because they, at the very least, seem to be agreed upon. The second and last scheduled day was a washout, but they couldn't have that, so went into a third. Now, immediately there must have been some concern amongst the teams because one of the umpires just straight up disappeared. The details, as I'm sure you can work out by now, are a bit murky, but there are multiple reports that one of the umpires just went missing because he gave a controversial LBW against an American player. And certainly this seems to be substantiated given the reports from the time that there were 2 umpires elected, and then Cricinfo and Cricket Archive also name an additional umpire that must have taken his place later. But this umpire isn't the only person who didn't rock up. George Wheatcroft, the star batsman for the US, was nowhere to be found. Of course, they just commenced play anyways, and Canada allowed a substitute fielder when the time came. The USA only added 3 runs to their total, bringing it up to 64. Canada then responded with 63, not really pressing home their advantage, and apparently the betting was now in favour of the Americans. And the opening partnership of 25 was apparently something to behold, with 40 minutes of the most electrifying international cricket ever seen. Real baseball stuff, from what I can tell. But then came the collapse. From none for 25, the USA were all out for 58. Except they'd only lost 9 wickets. Wheatcroft, still on the batting order, just still hadn't turned up. Sticklers for the rules, the Canadians wouldn't allow a replacement batsman. And so the game was won. But in a bizarre final turn of events, Wheatcroft did rock up, but 20 minutes after the game was finished. And nobody seems to have any idea as to why he was late, or why he actually bothered rocking up at all. But it seems like the Americans had a short argument trying to get the game restarted so that he could bat. But nobody was having it, and so it was quickly dropped. So, just to summarise, in what we recognise as the first ever international sports match, we don't know exactly who all the players were. We don't know from which clubs they came. We don't know who the Canadian captain was. We do know the American one. The scorecards are a complete and utter mess. The game got underway almost 2 hours late for no ostensible reason. There was a ludicrous amount of money gambled on the game. The umpire went missing and nobody seems to have batted an eye. And then the star player for the USA also went missing until he rocked up 20 minutes after the game had already finished. And all of it basically came about because the Americans were using ringers in their little cross-border games that themselves only began because some random person that we don't even know who it was played an unfathomably weird prank by impersonating a member of the Toronto Cricket Club. Sounds about right.